All right, we are back with episode 2 of the Fight Mind series with my co-host, Ghost.
Hey, what's up, guys? Happy to be here.
So, first off, happy to have you here. But so we, if anyone remembers, had talking about positioning and initiative in this episode. So, without further ado, we're going to dive into that.
Yeah, so I think we should start off with definitions of initiative. So there's actually a lot, but my specific definition is really simple. It's just the ability to make threats. Well, I'd like to get your definitions on this.
So, my definition, to kind of simplify and reduce down the way that I think we need to in order to really start building on like these kind of complex topics, is it's just sort of, the direction that one fighter wants it to go. It's sort of like a means by which to dictate things, or it's more or less like the direction that, you want it to be going in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So initiative is not a new term, like for the people that's watching, and it's not a new term that we invented. Like this has been discussed by Danny Martin from the Fight Site, who wrote a big article on this, and he discussed this on Heavy Hands, and they did an entire episode on just initiative. So this isn't a new topic. So another like definition that I really like is Fenyo from the Fight Site. He defines it as how you control the fight. And I think that's a really good definition for initiative.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly, and I should actually probably listen to that Heavy Hands episode. I just have to find it, but it sounds very interesting to me. The other definition of initiative that I find myself going back to is actually, it's from Jack Slack's Ringcraft series, is when I first heard it, but apparently it's from the writings of Miyamoto Musashi from back in like 16, whatever the hell, and it effectively describes the 3 initiatives, right? And so this, it's a pretty interesting concept because the way that you have to understand it is that, everything that happens in the cage, in a fight, any kind of fight, is built off of one of these 3 initiatives. So they are leading, delayed countering, and simultaneous countering. There are 3 very simple ideas that you'll see, pretty much across every single fight, across every single fighting style at some point or another. But you have to understand the interplay. I actually wrote about this. The way I described it was, if there are 3 basic stages of matter, the 3 initiatives are the 3 most basic modalities of fighting. So if one guy's trying to lead, that's their initiative. And it's not specifically relegated to being on the front foot. Like you would imagine, it's not like exclusive to being a pressure fighter. And then, obviously the opponent is going to be looking to counter in some way or another, unless they're trying to take the lead for themselves, in which case you have, sort of clashing initiatives. But the whole thing is built around, how am I going to do what I want to do to, maximize my potential, my athletic abilities, my, what have you in this fight, and just, sort of playing towards the win conditions you've set for yourself, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. And I think that ties in perfectly with Connor Raybush's definition of initiative. Because like you said, there's 3 of them, right? There's leading, there's the delayed counter, and there's a simultaneous counter. But you can't actually do that unless you outposition the opponent, correct? And that's one of his definitions of initiative, is being able to outposition your opponent, which I think is great because he describes it as like, if I were to stand behind you and then hit you with a rock, and then you try to turn, but I try to get behind you and then I hit you with the rock again. That's the bare bones idea of initiative from Connor. And I think that ties in with the 3 initiatives that Jack Slack talked about.
Yeah, so it's really just kind of, the methodology by which one fighter can kind of impose their will, so to speak, on another, or like, the approach that they're taking in order to do that. And I think, while I don't think positioning is necessarily a part of initiative itself, initiative is a bit more, in my opinion, to be like the theoretical framework of fighting. It's like the conceptual underpinnings by which everything is kind of built off of. To me, it's the idea, and then everything that you use, in the application of that, that's when we start getting into like the technical, mechanical side of things from my perspective.
Right. Yeah, like you said, like it may not be about position, but The ideas of initiative leads into position, right?
Yeah, you can't have one without the other. I mean, you can. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, so I think we should probably start talking about the positions of striking, right?
Yeah. So as we've kind of just alluded to, you can't really have one without the other. At least in high level fighting. At least in an application that will actually work for you in any substantive way. So that brings us to positioning. Positioning, you know, it's somewhat of the mechanical structure built on top of your initiative, if that makes sense. If the foundation, think of if you're building a house, like you have to lay the concrete slab or whatever, and then you can actually build, the frames and everything off of that. So that's the way that I view initiative. It's, the most basic, driving force in the recesses of your approach. But then, the means to do that heavily relies on positioning. And I think positioning and striking is a little bit different than overall positioning, right?
Yeah, like yeah, positions in striking, it's a lot more variable than it is like in on the ground. Because on the ground, like if I have a person, if I'm on top half guard, I know the bottom person only has a few moves, right? In striking, whether you're far range, mid range, or close range, there's lots of variables that can go on, right?
Yeah, and then there's even weird shit that people will do. Like I always think of the example of Hamzat, his finish against Aliskarov on the regional scene. He goes for an inside slip rear uppercut, which to me makes absolutely no goddamn sense. Like it doesn't make sense physically for me. So there's sort of an extra level of variability in striking that doesn't necessarily exist in quite the same way in grappling.
Yeah, and I think that goes into the idea of control, because in grappling, you'll have more control of your opponent. In striking, you're pretty much controlling the space, which, again, there's a lot more variability in that than there is in groundwork or clinch work.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, sort of the core of positioning and striking, at least in my opinion, is sort of the composition of your stance. It's where your weight is at. It's where, you're physically positioned, and that, in effect, it creates the means by which you can generate power, right? And it also, ensures that you can absorb power, that it can, be translated across your body. So you're not, if you're positioned well to take a shot, it will generally absorb better throughout your body if you're not on one leg, if you're not overextended over your hips or anything like that. And I think that's sort of a key component that gets missed in, a lot of analysis and all of that.
And now that you mentioned stance, I think this is a good time to talk about like far range, because I think that's where stance really is misunderstood. Neither of you can strike at each other. Like even if you take a step in, you're still too far to strike from each other. So that's far range. And to understand stance from this range, the main thing that you'll see most fighters do is square up here, because there's no danger of your opponent stepping in. Like they'll have to close a large amount of distance in order to get to this range. So they'll square up their stance, and what we mean by that is both our feet are level, and squared stances, it's good for circling lateral movement. The problem with it is you're open to straight shots. Now, the other stance that we mentioned, or that will be mentioned, is staggered. If you're staggered, it gives you a lot of back and forth movement. So like you're going north-south, and you get quick in and out movement from far range. And that's like the karate style stance, right? Where you can move forward and backward really quickly. And I think what's really important to distinguish here is that, like, again, we're talking about far range. When you're square and you're circling, people don't really understand why they circle. And this goes hand in hand with why we're talking about initiative, because you don't actually need to be moving forward to gain the initiative. It's the person that's controlling the fight. If you're like the reason why people circle is so they're fighting half the man, so they're only fighting half their tools. And for somebody like a ring general, circling, lateral movement, and like pivoting away, that is a good way for them to get initiative on an aggressive opponent.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, another thing that kind of ties into initiative especially once you're talking about, being on the outside range, is generally at a lower level. You see a lot of these, what I call you go, I go fights, which is essentially, it's just trading initiative. It's where both guys want to lead, and you'll see, both guys standing on the outside, burst in, or one guy bursts in, lands a couple shots on the guard, resets. The other guy goes, okay, it's my turn, and does the same thing. And that's sort of, in my opinion, like a very low level application of, positioning first and foremost, because you're kind of just there for them to run in on, as well as initiative. It's creating essentially 50-50 engagements that you don't really want in high level fighting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, right. And like for high level fighting, you want to be the one that you go and you keep going, not you go, I go. Like you don't want to give that up, right? That initiative that you've taken from the first exchange, you want to build off of that exchange, if that makes sense, right?
Exactly. And that's not something that's always going to be possible. Not everyone is capable of just, slamming their foot on the gas at all times and, just moving forward or anything like that. But that's not exactly, what it is. That's not what, dictating engagements has to be. I think it does bring us to another key topic, and that's denying initiative.
Initiative. Yeah, that's a good point.
So the most picture perfect example I can think of for that is Jose Aldo against Jonathan Martinez just not too long ago, where, Aldo, especially in this kind of later stage of his career, has always been a guy who's reliant on countering. So, every time guys are coming in, he's inside slip, overhand, inside slip, lead hook to the body, stuff like that. But as he's aging a little bit, the eyes aren't there as much as they used to be. The defensive reactions aren't there as much as they used to be. But despite that, he always maintains incredible positioning in striking exchanges. He's always in a position to absorb a shot, always in a position to give a shot. He's rarely ever overextended. And more often than not, he's always making sure to be on the superior angle, especially in like what would otherwise be a 50-50 engagement. But the thing that I loved against Martinez, Aldo would throw something out there, land 1, 2, 3, and then Martinez goes, okay, it's my turn to counter. And Jose Aldo's throwing up those little teeps to the thigh, teeps to the hip, which are completely off balancing Martinez. And it's essentially giving Aldo the initiative back. So he can continue building from there, even while still having this somewhat energy conservative style where he has to explode a little bit when he's countering, he has to explode a little bit when he's leading. He doesn't have to keep his foot on the gas the whole time. If he can make you overswing, lose balance, then it's his turn to go again while he's had, a little bit to recharge, I guess.
And like you said, denying initiative, and I think you brought up that specific example of keeping the thigh. I think that's a great example of denying initiative because he's essentially keeping Martinez off balance when he wants to attack, when he's trying to regain his own initiative, right?
Exactly.
And a thing I was taught like really early on when I first started training in MMA was one of the ultimate strategies you can have is keeping somebody off balance. And Jose Aldo and Jonathan Martinez, I think Aldo did a great job of keeping Martinez like off balance throughout that fight. Not just the teeps to the thigh, but like being able to read checks, being able to force him to cover up, and then throw body shots, and then get angles for his knees.
And he was he was doing a lot off of the knee raise feint in that one too. So, and that it folds in very well with the teep to the thigh, show the knee raise, and then he was coming up with the rear side high kick. So always occupying the guard, always, like I touched upon in the last installment of the series, is fatiguing the decision-making systems, It's kind of paralysis by analysis, overloading them with so many looks that, they don't really have a chance to get in the fight to begin with. And you can kind of separate further and further, the longer it goes.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that adds to that. That's a really good point about like overloading the system, right? Because Brad Riddell and Israel Adesanya, they have this idea called building a foundation. So often we see fighters feint, like they feint at every distance, right? But they don't actually understand why they're feinting or what that feint is used for. So in the city kickboxing mold, they say build a foundation, which means you need to establish a threat first. So like with Israel Adesanya, for example, he wants to establish the jab and the rear leg outside low kick, right? So once he's established those things, he can start showing the head and shoulder feint and the rear leg feint, right? And with Aldo, in your example with Martinez, he kept keeping the thigh, and that builds into his raised knee, his raised leg feint, right? His fake teep, and that allows him to shoot distance. So yeah, I think so. I think that ties back into what we were talking about earlier, like the ability to make threats.
Exactly. And I think that ties into positioning a little bit as well, especially, given the example of the little knee raise feint, because you can step up into that. That's, a bit of a sneaky way of covering distance. Raise that lead knee and take a little almost hump with the back foot to just kind of glide forward just a little bit. And then, you're on a new plane, you're on a new, range. So that's a way to get from, outside to a little bit closer to the mid range. And it's something that a lot of times guys don't necessarily know this as much. And I think that's another really interesting wrinkle to his game.
Right. And speaking of mid range, I think this is a good time to define what mid range actually is.
After you,
So
my
for
friend.
me, yeah, so for me, mid range, they call this. So I took this from Fight Ready. They call it borders. It's different from other places, like in Bang Tao, it's knuckle to knuckle. Demetrius Johnson calls it the void, but it's essentially the distance where if you and I were to extend our lead hands and we were fighting, we'd be able to touch knuckle to knuckle. And this is the extended distance that's you need for MMA because obviously we have takedowns and you also have people who are trying to close that distance. And the reason why in Fight Ready they call it borders is because it's one step away from either fighter being able to low kick and jab. So they're saying that it's the fighter has to determine when they have to cross that border. That's why they call it, or that's why Fight Ready at least calls it borders.
Yeah, that it makes perfect sense. And the way I view it, the mid range is, to me, it's exactly that. It's kind of a range. So it's borders is like the outside end of the mid range, whereas, a couple steps inside is sort of, it's where your ones and twos are going to land. It's inside the border, but I consider that still in the mid range. Whereas, another step or two inside from there, I consider the pocket, if that makes sense.
Right. So like it's playing in between far and close range, right? You're playing in between like way far out or way too close. You're playing that zone. And I think this is the zone where most feints are effective. Because another thing people don't understand is for feints to be effective, the person has to see it and then react to it, right?
Yeah. And it has to be, there has to be some sort of established threat, at least a little bit, like in the idea space, like you have to, be able to show a jab and the other guy reasonably believe, okay, you're going to jab me. Otherwise, you're not getting a reaction and you can't build from there in any substantive way. It's just kind of wasted movement, right?
Right, right. And then I think an important note about borders is that this isn't like in a fight, it's not always like the same range, right? Like if fighters were to stick their arms out all the time, it's not always the same because it changes where you are in the cage. Like say my back's to the cage, I no longer have control of that distance, and I no longer have control of borders. If that makes any sense, right?
Yeah, that makes sense because it's essentially depending on where you are in the cage, your in cage positioning, where you're actually physically located, it kind of determines, what options you have available to you. And in effect, it can greatly limit you, especially if you're the one backing towards the cage, even in terms of like your basic positioning. Like you can only move back so far before you can't really maintain a staggered stance. You have to square up. And that's where, as a pressure fighter, that's exactly where you want guys. That's where Ilya Topuria wants guys so he can, unload with all of his power and make sure that you're more of a sitting duck, so to speak.
And another thing to add, when you are behind that black line, like you mentioned, your feints are almost always useless because you need time and space to operate feints, right? So when you're behind that black line and you try to, I think you can feint at somebody, and that may relieve pressure, but that's a totally different argument or totally different conversation.
Yeah, and
But
it's
if you're,
useless if you can't get out from there. If you can show a feint and stop someone in the tracks for half a second, guess what? They're going to keep going. If you
yeah,
can't
exactly.
circle out effectively or like get to your angle.
Right, exactly. Like I said earlier, you need time and space in order to use feints when you're and when you're behind that black line, you can't really do that.
Yeah, and I think one thing I noticed is to the earlier point, like where you're physically located determines a lot of your tools. It also determines a bit of the way that guys will fight. So like, you'll see guys who are on the back foot up against the cage. Sometimes they'll be trying to just throw out a little bit more volume just to get someone off of them so they can try and get on the bike and get out of there. Other times you'll see guys just try and rely on that one big shot, which in effect is going to keep you on the back foot even more. And then, other times you'll see guys kind of just do something to collapse that range, do something to, not necessarily be feeling the pressure, feeling that sort of claustrophobic element that good pressure fighting should kind of effectuate.
And to add, like closing down that range, like it's a lot easier to do it when the opponent is behind the interior line, right? In the middle of the cage, space is your friend, and that's what like most ring generals or cage generals use in order to circle the cage and control distance. And then there's the interior black line where in the UFC specifically, there's a painted interior black line within the octagon. And if you're behind that line, a lot of your movement is limited to left, right, or to your opponent.
Yeah.
So if you're in, yeah,
The
go
way
ahead.
that I view it is, once you're back behind the black, generally you have four directions you can move in: forwards, backwards, either side, right?
Mm-hmm.
Once you are back behind the line, you only have three available, right? So it's severely limiting your offensive and defensive capabilities. And, to your point, Borders doesn't necessarily work there because you have kind of forfeited control of it. You don't have the ability to really navigate the border, so to speak, because you're the one that's on the back foot. You're the one that's, you have a very limited amount of space in which you can operate.
And on the other hand, the guy that's in front of that block line, he's the one that's in charge of borders.
Yeah.
Right?
And he has control of all four directions. He can go any which way he chooses. You have one less option, and that's
Exactly.
not where you want to be.
And I think this is something that MMA fighters, or at least with people in the UFC or fighters in the UFC, I think that that black line is a really good guideline for both ring cutters as well as ring generals. Because for the ring general, the moment you reach that black line, like that's when you know you need to cut an angle, right? And for ring cutters, you know they can't feint, you know they can't move backwards anymore, so you can slowly chew up space.
Yep. And I think that kind of brings us to a bit of the overarching point. Like when you're, scouting, when you're doing analysis, these are the kinds of things that I think take a little bit of priority, or at least, in terms of what you're looking for, what you're trying to observe is like, how will someone's behavior change once they're behind that black line, should they get there? And, in a much more general sense, like, when they don't have the initiative, what are their responses? What is the depth of their ability when it comes to like, I'm on the back foot now. I like to be leading. I like to be on the front foot. What options do I have? Do I have, one simple step back, 2-3 counter or whatever? Or do I have, a little bit more substance to fall back on? Can I, step back, exit, get to my angle, whatever? I think that's something that, to me, I find important to look at, especially when trying to like gauge someone's ceiling, their potential, and all that. Do you have a perspective on that, especially
Yeah,
from the
I think you bring
scouting?
up a really good point because as much as you know, I don't really like to look at stats, right? But I think this is an area where you can look at stat or a stat that you should look at is how often are they circling out when they reach that black line, right? That's a stat that could actually be important in scouting, even in regular gambling, maybe. Like, how often do they get backed up? And like putting a numerical value to that, and like which side are they exiting? Which side, like which side are they committing to most of the time when they reach that black line? I think that's an interesting stat to look at.
Yeah, because especially as we've said before, predictability is the antithesis of elite level fighting. It's impossible to be completely unpredictable. Everyone has a set of tools and tricks that they like to go to that they're the best at, and it's a matter of how deep they can go with the way that they mix it up. But things like that, like if you have someone who's just going to back themselves up, like Tyron Woodley for the most extreme example, you can reasonably assume how their fights are going to go with a really adept pressure fighter, with someone like Rory McDonald who can, sit there at range and feint you into inactivity and then keep you from finding any kind of rhythm or timing to get your shots off, right?
Right. And I think that ties into like the building the foundation idea that I mentioned with Israel Adesanya and Brad Riddell. Like we mentioned earlier that Israel Adesanya wants to build a foundation. And he actually doesn't want to counter strike, if that makes any sense. Because a lot of people have this idea that Adesanya wants to sit back and counter with, and he wants to use those feints to draw out big reactions. But the reality is, he wants you to react a certain way. He wants you to parry, stand still, and then look at his lead shoulder feint and react to that. Right?
Yep.
Like,
Yeah. He wants
yeah,
to freeze guys and, keep them, again, not being able to take initiative really, keeping guys at the edge of his jab, his low kick. And then kind of the backup plan is, all right, if you're going to step in, throw a big looping overhand, I'm going to lean back, throw, my lead hook.
predictable stuff. Right?
Exactly.
Like he wants predictable leads and predictable reactions. What he hates the most is when they don't react a certain way, right? Like in the Jan Blachowicz fight, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Because Jan's not reacting to his feints and you can see almost the moment where he feels a little bit lost. Like, this works on everyone else. Why isn't this working? You're supposed to be reacting to it this way. Why are you not doing that? Right?
Right. And what's actually funny about the Jan Blachowicz fight is he was actually overreacting sometimes, and Adesanya had no answers for it. Because he doesn't actually want overreactions. He wants you to stay still,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And that's how he gains initiative.
And that's actually something that I think Sean O'Malley does a good amount of, especially with his little like head fakes, which very, very much on display against Aljamain Sterling, because Aljo is, a lot of his game is built off of that kind of nonstop forward pressure. That's how he gets guys to the cage. That's how he's able to wrestle super effectively. And he uses his kind of pitter patter striking to just keep something in guys' faces so they have to back up and all that. O'Malley being the, caliber of a striker he is, he knew that just showing these little head feints, little hip fakes, stuff like that, causes that split second of hesitation. So, Aljo's going forward, has to freeze for a second. Go forward, freeze for a second. And that's how he was able to, get Sterling over swinging. And that's how he was able to glide back, find that left hand counter, I think it was.
Right. And I think that's a perfect example of initiative moving backwards, right?
Yeah. And that's,
Right. So,
that's to a degree, that's, delayed countering, to go back to the three initiatives. But at the same time, it's, what I consider the secret fourth initiative, and that's, negating. So if you know that his A game is pressure to come forwards, and you have just a little something that can, put the smallest grain of sand in those gears, that's, your method by which to negate their initiative. And that's where you can take your own. Does that make sense?
yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Putting that small grain of sand to like disrupt the gears from turning correctly, or to make the gears start grinding, right?
Yep, exactly. Because then eventually, you get the little grain of sand in there, it starts grinding down, and then eventually, over time, the whole structure breaks down. And that's kind of the way that I view high level fighting. It's like, you don't have to be completely dominating every single thing. You don't have to be keeping so many things in their mind that they just can't get the ball rolling in any direction. All you really need to do against an elite level opponent, and this is to your point from last week, is, get a little stepping stone, not, a little foothold, so you can start to build, you can start to disrupt their rhythm, their timing, their initiative, all of that sort of stuff.
Right. I think another good example of doing that where your A game and you make adjustments to your A game and you put that grain of sand and it makes their gear start to grind. And an example of that moving backwards is Ioane and Jacek and Jessica Andrade, right? Because Jessica Andrade, if you really think about it, when you're fighting her head on the tracks, which we'll talk about later, you're gonna lose like every woman in the division is probably gonna lose against that if you fight her like in a straight line, right?
Yeah, if you can
So
see the initiative or let her, build off of hers.
right, exactly. The thing about Joanna is that she used her jab and then she used that to create angles. And when she got near that black line that we talked about earlier, she'd take like huge L steps and then try to take the center of the cage. And that is a way of taking initiative, but still going backwards. Because Joanna's jab was on point in that, and her jab only works when the opponent is walking onto it. And this is a really good example of using that to maintain the initiative, right? She's constantly jabbing at Jessica Andrade, and Jessica Andrade is constantly swinging wild. And then when Jessica Andrade isn't swinging wild and standing still, like trying to reset, Joanna would jab and then throw the rear or the step up left high kick. Because a habit that Andrade has, which takes away her initiative most of the time, is when she's moving forward and she sees a jab, she'll parry and then lean to the rear side. And for somebody that's always moving forward, that's not a good way to gain initiative because you're taking yourself out, you're moving into the pocket and then you're taking yourself out of it at the same time.
Yeah. And I think there's a good tie-in to just general positioning there is, if you're the one moving forwards, going back into your rear side, it's essentially neutering your forward pressure. It's, it's getting you away from where you want to be and it's putting you into, a decently susceptible position, right?
Right, because now you're like, when you do that and you started with in the pocket, you're essentially like going from the pocket to borders, but you're leaving your legs and you're leaving your legs in the pocket.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, right?
Yep. It's getting your ranges mixed up a little bit. It's not being in the right position for, the larger position that you're in. If you're, Izzy is actually another good example of this, Adesanya, especially against Strickland, when he keeps looking for that, lean back, lead hook, how many times was he kind of finding himself way out of position, way back here as Strickland's just coming forwards, it's not going to work, especially, with the wide open shoulders he was having. It's like, you need to be in the position for, the location that the fight is happening in. You can't have it one way or the other. It has to be pretty structured, I guess.
Right, and to add to what you were saying about that is when he was leaning back with like little space behind him. So like he can't step back and change positions like he can in the middle of the cage, right? He was doing that when his back was to the cage.
Yeah, and you only have so far back you can go before you can't go anymore, right?
Right. Like I know I know, or at least I know you do, but you talk about Adesanya's like habits that aren't mechanically right. Like he can actually get away with that when he's in the middle of the cage, right?
Yeah, and made a career of it.
Yeah, right. Where like he can cross his feet and then angle out, but like when he's at the end of the cage, or when he's behind that black line and his back is to the cage, he can't actually do that anymore. And that's how Tricky's caught him.
Yeah, that's I think the way that I like to look at it is behind the black line is a bit of the pressure cooker where, all of the little mistakes that you can get away with in open space, all of the little things that you can all the little corner cutting you can do is not going to work anymore. The stakes are so much higher. If you're, a lean back guy, you can't really do that without putting yourself at serious risk. All it takes is a guy stepping in. You can't take a step back. If you're all the way back here behind your hips, it's not going to end well.
Right, and I think that brings us to another idea is the pocket, right? Because when you're behind that black line, you're going to, like, we said earlier that you can only go left, right, or forward, right? But I think that ties into the idea of the pocket, the close distance. Like you're gonna have to know how to fight in that distance, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's the one thing that I say pretty often is that, like, guys have to have some ability to navigate all three of these ranges: the outside, borders, mid range, the inside. You know, you can't hope to really get to the elite level without having at least some degree of comfort in each of those phases. Ismail Bonfim versus Nazim Sadikov.
Yeah.
So one of the first things that Bonfim does is, he waits for Sadikov to enter and just, I think it was a shifting, overhand lead hook that he threw, but he threw them both with as much power as he could. And then after that, you see this like very distinct dynamic where Sadikov is trying to maintain his kicking range. He's staying on the outside at like the absolute end of his range where he's not going to necessarily be at risk of eating those big shots now that he's kind of felt what they did on his forearms, on his guard. And then when he's trying to get inside, he's going all the way in. So skipping the mid-range and just kind of blitzing in. And that's actually where it opened up a lot of Bonfim's offense. That's where he was able to find his little sit-down counters on shots. Because this guy's all the way out here. Now I know he doesn't feel comfortable being in the pocket with me. So he's going to try and go all the way from the outside, all the way to the inside. And that's, a big gap to exploit.
Right. So the pocket, like for those that are listening for the first time, it's the striking zone. So the striking zone or the fight zone. Like in Fight Ready, they call it the fight zone. Because this is the area where both of you guys can get hit with takedowns or strikes, right?
Yeah, this is where every option is available to you, pretty much. You can jab, you can lead hook, rear, overhand, whatever.
And like you said, Bonfim, like he thrives in the pocket, right? Because Sadikov was taking that extended distance and then trying to wade in, right?
Yeah.
And we're trying to not wade in, crashing in.
Yeah. You could sense the discomfort, and I thought that was actually a very good read, a good look from Bonfim. But obviously the adjustment from Sadikov ended in that bizarre finish, but beautiful question mark kick. But that's neither here nor there.
Yeah. So what people don't understand is it's actually dangerous. Like if you don't have the proper mechanics, it's actually dangerous to hang around in the pocket.
Well, generally the way that I view it is you don't really want to hang in the pocket unless you're John Lineker or honestly Jessica Andrade is kind of another example of like someone that wants to be in there and feels comfortable leading and countering. But the way that I typically view it is you want to be in and out. Like that's why we have entries and exits. You don't want to just sit there taking pictures, as DC says, or staring at your work or whatever it is the guys say. Because essentially the way that high level competition of any sort really happens is you want to take away as many opportunities from your opponent as possible. And standing there, on the tracks in a 50-50 engagement with guys, you don't want it to be even. You want it to be as levered against them as you can possibly get it, right?
Right. And like to define what on the tracks are, so it's the angle in the pocket where slipping actually occurs. So to define on the tracks, it just means that if we're in a close stance matchup, so orthodox versus orthodox or southpaw versus southpaw, it means that my lead foot would be lined up to Jesse's rear foot, and my rear foot would be lined up to Jesse's lead foot. And yeah, and you need to be on the tracks, like Jesse said, you need to have an iron chin, like John Lineker and Jessica Andrade, and you can't have any fear at all, right?
Yeah, you have to be a little savage. And don't get me wrong, I love all of those guys, but I don't necessarily consider it like very tactically savvy necessarily.
Right. I think there are a few times where you can do that, but again, you need some physical attributes in order to execute that game plan. And I think that goes back to where they do well, like where on the tracks fighters do well, is when they have their opponents like on the like near the fence or behind that black line, right?
Yep, because then, in effect, it's no longer an even matchup, right? Now that we've taken away, your control over initiative, your control over range, your directionality, now what was a 50-50 matchup, just, 3 steps in the other direction is completely loaded in my favor if I'm, the one on the tracks pushing forwards and you're the one going backwards, right?
Right, exactly. And then not many fighters are comfortable diffusing pressure, so they don't actually know how to circle out or pivot, right?
No,
Pivot.
with pivoting, goddamn, I think we have to at least do like a supplemental episode on pivoting and the
Yeah, on pivot,
mechanics
yeah.
and all of the ways that it can work because
I
if
think
we
that's a
had,
completely different thing.
yeah, that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother day. But in this instant, very important to at least know how to pivot in some, semblance.
Right. And circle out to the rear side, right?
Yep. And then, another little look off of that is something that actually I think Adesanya was very good at in his prime was misdirecting, circling one way and then cutting back on a dime to the other. Once you've got, especially against like a good cage cutter, if you get them really committing to one direction, then if you have the agility, the, footwork, whatever, to quickly cut the other way, and then it sets up kind of either direction that you choose should you get backed up again. You can conceivably go either direction or make them think that you're going to misdirect again, right?
Right, because, and to add to that, like a good cage cutter, they're going to try to take away one side. And then they want you to commit to the other side and forward. So, like for Adesanya, like you mentioned, like he does in his prime, he did a good job of trying to get that person to commit to one direction and then he'll slip out the other way to take center. And that was his way of gaining initiative, right?
Yeah. So again, it's taking a position where the other guy ostensibly has the initiative and forcing them to overswing, overcommit, or getting them to somehow freeze for that split second so that you can then circle out or do whatever it is to get the initiative, be it like sitting down on the right hand and then circling out or just circling out straight in response to the pressure. It's doing something to take that initiative back, and then you're again back at a bit of a more even matchup where, off the reset, either guy can kind of try and steal the initiative, but it's more 50-50 than just, oh, you're pressuring me and I have 3 directions to move. If you're a good cage cutter, now I have 2 directions to move. Great,
And like on the tracks, I think it's important to understand that just because you're on the tracks, it doesn't mean that you have to stay there, right?
No.
Like a good way to gain initiative is to understand the pocket angles, right? So
Yes.
I define 2 of them. So one of them is squared off. So that one's a little bit different from like your squared stance. You're essentially putting your, like, if I'm gonna go from on the tracks to squared off, I'm essentially putting my lead foot in the opponent's belly button or crotch.
Yep. In that, invisible line bisecting their stance, essentially.
Right. And a good example of this would be Floyd Mayweather. He'll enter with a body jab on the tracks, but he'll exit squaring the opponent off. If that makes any sense. So he's going to the angle where his opponent's belly button is.
Yeah, and that's where they're
that's
mechanically weak as well. I apologize.
Right. And because, like you said, they're mechanically weak, and they have to turn in order to reset the exchange, right?
Yeah, because when I'm squared onto you, now both of my hands have completely different ranges, and I can't generate nearly as much power, right? If my shoulders are facing you, if you're facing my belly button, it's a lot harder for me to get off anything meaningful unless I take that step, recorrect my stance, and that split second gives you the opportunity to do something that I don't have the luxury of doing anything against, really.
Right, and because, like, since you're squared off, your offense is dictated by where your hips are or where your hips are facing. But when you square somebody off, like I said earlier, their offense is now facing 12 o'clock while you're at 9 o'clock.
And then, also from there, that's where you have the easiest takedowns of your life. So I think, there's one example on this topic that actually comes up to mind where it kind of blends everything together. And it was Alexander Volkanovski versus Max Holloway 3, where, Max is trying to cut Volkanovski off. They're not necessarily, at the cage yet, but he's trying to cut off, his angles, his, lateral movement, and essentially force him straight back. So what Volk is doing is he's, stepping back into his right. And, I think he lands a couple jabs or throws a couple jabs out just to kind of slow down Holloway's forward movement. And then on a dime cuts and starts circling to his left so that he gets Max squared. And then from there, he steps into the pocket and just bangs. I think it was like a lead uppercut or rear uppercut, lead hook, and then steps back off even further than angle to his lead side to the left. So I think that's, if it might be a little hard to visualize, it's because I probably explained it poorly, but it was a very smart, little exchange where I thought he did kind of everything correctly and was able to take advantage of, the distance, the range, the movement, the positioning, as well as the initiative, right?
And it's also forcing Max to turn that entire time, right? Max has to readjust where his hips are facing while Volkanovski is moving right, left, and then squaring him off, right?
Yeah. So I think, to me, that's sort of like the gold standard. Those are the things that you're not going to be able to get off super reliably all the time, but that's the kind of dynamic that you want to look for, is like, control over every little aspect. And I think he was doing a lot of his hand trapping to that as well. And, to the earlier point about on the tracks, one of the easiest ways that you'll see super commonly in MMA for guys to kind of immediately switch up that dynamic is to switch stances, right? So it A, collapses the distance, and it B, puts us on a completely different plane. So I'm on somewhat of a different angle now, especially if I'm like stepping out as I'm switching, doing a little like A step switch, or, even like a little L step, or what is it, the switch 45?
Switch 45, yeah. Where you take the step out and then you take a step with your rear foot coming in.
Or the pep step, as you're, or moving laterally, step in off that left hand. So you're kind of switching stances, catching guys, off rhythm.
Yeah, but they're still along the tracks. I think that's the important distinction to make here, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think the last angle that we should talk about is on the fence. So this isn't the fence that's the wall behind us, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is so Trevor Whitman calls this on the fence because this is when your lead foot and your opponent's lead foot are lined up.
Yep, they're on a straight line with one another. So,
right. And he calls it that because you're essentially fencing with the opponent, right? And the weird thing here is when you're on the fence, you actually want to square your stance a little bit when you take this angle because you have enough time to rotate your hips across the opponent's lead shoulder if it's a close stance matchup.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important distinction here, but I think that's a little bit too in the weeds, right?
Yeah, that'll get a little. I feel like that's something we might need, like actual
we'll talk about
physical.
Later, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Physical medium to talk about.
Yeah, because that one's a little bit difficult. Because I assume not a great deal of people watch fencing regularly. So.
Right, but this is something that like I know Lyoto Machida and Kyoji Horiguchi they like to operate at borders. But one of the things, like, Kyoji Horiguchi does this beautifully, but one of the things he likes to do is when he enters with a right hand along the tracks, and then he weaves out to his right, that's getting on the fence. That's a good example of getting on the fence.
And I think that's actually, the Machida example is sort of like the perfect encapsulation of, a simultaneous countering as an initiative. That's like sort of the gold standard there. Think of the Bader knockout where Bader's, stepping in with this huge whatever the hell it was supposed to be, and Machida just steps in right at the perfect time, lands his rear hand, and he's doing that, if I recall correctly, from, on the fence. So he affords himself that little bit of squaredness, and that's what helps him explode in, land that, kill shot, essentially.
Right, because Bader's coming in along the tracks, right?
And opening himself up wildly in doing so.
Yeah, so this is actually an angle that you won't actually see much like within close stance because not many people know how. Because when you're taught boxing, you're taught to stay in stance all the time. But what people don't know is the dynamics of a fight is constantly changing your stance.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, every step is to some degree a sacrifice of stance, because you can't physically move both feet at the same time unless you're doing a little hop, in which case don't fucking do that. That's stupid. But, you have to move one foot first and then the other. Very, very basic stuff, right? But in doing so, you're elongating and shortening your stance. So it's some degree of a sacrifice in stance and base. And it's just, it's not rigid. It's very fluid, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it's a constantly variable thing within the fight, right? Stance. Because we often talk about staggered where your feet should be, but that's always changing based on the distance based on where you are in the cage, based on what you're trying to do after you exit the pocket. So all those things like we have to take into consideration when you're talking about stance, right?
Yeah. And there's always little rule breaks, like, your step up low kick. You're stepping your rear foot up to your lead foot almost so that you can then, collapse the distance, get yourself closer than you would have been had you been, rigid in your stance. And it's also, to the point of Alexander Volkanovski, to the point of being on the fence, that sets up a lot of, that little step up, the way that he integrates that into a variety of different attacks, be it the leg kick, be it the jab. Like, that's how he gets his lancing jab off a lot of times, stepping that rear leg up and then getting onto that on the fence angle. So he can just lance through with that jab, and that also then augments his lateral movement.
Right. To add about Volkanovski, like that's a weapon he uses to create initiative, right? Because like you said, builds off of that because everybody can see a step up because when you move your back leg up to your heel,
Yeah, it's noticeable.
it's a slow kick because everybody can see that. And he uses that to build reactions and build offense off of it. Because
Yeah,
if the
just different
opponent
looks.
stands up, yeah, different looks. And like if the opponent, because it's easy to check, right? If the opponent checks, he can step up and jab right hand. If the opponent backs up, he can take up that space that was just given up, right? So that's a good way for him to seize initiative, right?
Yes, and it's also not that this is necessarily how he used it, but I think it's also, one of the potential options in the toolbox for guys to kind of navigate through borders without necessarily showing that, I'm looking to get past the border. Especially off of that like lead hand fight against, Southpaw if you're orthodox, you can show that little step up to get further inside than you were a second ago, if that makes sense.
Right. And I think that's a good point because borders, like, there's only a few things you can do at that distance, right? And one of them, I mentioned this in my tip sheet, is the step up low kick
Yeah.
and the step up high kick, right?
Yeah.
That's a way to close that distance.
And, to a certain degree, it's keeping something, in their vision that helps you cover that distance a little bit more safely. Especially, I think one of my favorite examples, it's not a step up as much as it is a switch, but it was TJ Dillashaw's little drop shift, if you're familiar with it, where
Yeah,
he
I'm
would
familiar with
throw
that.
his jab, switch his stance, and drop his level a little bit, and then come up with that high kick. So that was, I think, how he set up the finish against Cody Garbrandt the first time, was this really tricky little thing, especially against the guy who's looking to come forwards, looking to kind of land big shots, put the jab in their face. He's going to want to try the counter, and then switch, head kick.
Right. And that was a really good way of using borders and entering the pocket, right? We're not using borders specifically, right?
Yeah,
Because
it's taking
Cody
advantage of
Garbrandt,
borders.
right? And Cody Garbrandt, he is another example of an on the track fighter, right?
Oh, entirely.
He's an example of keeping people on the tracks and then just blasting them out from there, right? Yeah, and I think that is a good example of TJ using the drop shift to take advantage of that tendency of always staying on the tracks because all of his reactions are meant for 12 o'clock, right?
Yep. And also it afforded TJ, just in doing that little drop shift, he's now at a superior angle. So, he's taking advantage of the space, of the distance, of the positioning. So he's dropped his level, so he's a little bit more compact. Should a big shot come through, he can absorb it a little bit better. And now he's, on the superior angle, so either you have to adjust or as it happened in that fight, get kicked in the fucking head.
Right, and in that case, I think the angle was he was more on the fence, right? Because
Yep. Well,
yeah.
TJ was the one backing up, if I recall correctly.
Right, yeah. So I think he was the one on the fence. Do it, yeah. He took like when he took the drop shift, he took the slight angle was him getting to the fence, right?
Yep. And that's that I think is to tie it all together. That's a good example of like, A, denying their initiative and B, taking your own while still being in, what's on paper a bit of a worse position, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. I think that ties it in perfectly.
All right, I think that's where we should call it today. We're going to be back with, what are we thinking? Just a lot of the fence wrestling and grappling sort of.
I think we should start off with fence wrestling, actually.
Yeah.
Grappling, there's way too much. There's a lot more of that than there is for fence wrestling, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of meat to both of those, but definitely there's a whole lot more variability with grappling overall, considering, the
right initiative
different...
along the fence. I think that should be our next topic.
I agree, because we can tie that in very well to wall wrestling and all that, I think.
Yeah. So in MMA, like, the wall is what separates MMA from the rest of the sport, right? So I think that's a really good thing to talk about, like initiative, like that's unique to MMA, right?
Yeah. Oh, exactly. That's where the MMA specific techniques have kind of been born, where at least where like the MMA specific tactics have been born of late. But I think also it gives me an opportunity to talk about my personal favorite topic in MMA, which is transitional offense. But we'll get to that next time.
Right.
Do you have anything to plug, my friend?
Yeah, so again, join me on or subscribe to my YouTube, which is at Phantom Punch Breakdowns. No spaces in between at all. And then join the Substack, because I can put copyrighted stuff on there and the UFC can't find me.
Well, they don't even know what Substack is.
Yeah, they don't even know what Substack is.
They're not cool enough. That's what happens when you hang out with Elon Musk. I also have a Substack. I pitched it on last week's episode. I guess I'll do it again. It's combatwrapup.substack.com. Again, I can post copyrighted stuff there. I will post this on there, as well as Spotify. But I think that's all I got to plug. Thank you for your time, my friend.
You can also find this episode on my YouTube channel, right?
Yes, you can, with a way cooler logo than I created, because I don't know how to do art no good. All right, my friend, it was great chatting with you, and I can't wait to do it again.
All right, yeah, this is awesome.
Peace.